to discuss some of his more recent work, Adam Grant. And so to welcome Adam to the stage, please join me in giving a warm welcome to Charlie Newark-French, Chief Executive Officer at Cascade.
Thank you, Chris. Cheers. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining this session. I'm very excited for this one. By way of introduction, as Chris just said, I'm Charlie. I'm the CEO of a company called Cascade. Hopefully you have seen our logo more than a few times at this point, and we have a team and a booth out there. Please do stop by and say hello. At Cascade, we use artificial intelligence to help companies execute on their strategy. We use AI to help digitize strategy, track against it, and then ultimately give direction and guidance and recommendations to CEOs, CSOs, and teams throughout an organization on where they should spend their time to improve business performance. This software category is called strategy-led performance. As you can imagine, our next speaker, Adam Grant, is a strategy expert. So I'm extremely excited, given Cascade's focus, to have the opportunity to introduce him here today. And also, I'll be sitting on that stool over there on the left-hand side, doing the Q&A after Adam has finished his talk. At Cascade, we have a 10-year vision, which is 4 words. It is strategy is everyone's business. That combines 2 ideas there, the idea of long-term thinking and the idea of talent. Adam Grant is the preeminent thought leader when it comes to those 2 ideas, and particularly the combination of those 2 ideas, strategy and talent. So as a quick overview, I think you all know Adam Grant at this point. He's incredibly famous. But as a quick overview, Adam has devoted his career to helping leaders think through the psychology of performance, how teams achieve their best, how they overcome challenges, how they keep curiosity in their mind, and ultimately how they keep continuous improvement. Adam's latest book, Hidden Potential, that book is available in the Barnes & Noble's booth out there, by the way. It's a great read. That explores ideas of resilience, adaptability, and how to thrive in times of disruption. And I think at this point, we're all in alignment that disruption is just the way that business is done. It's just the context in which we operate in. So without further ado, I'd like to bring on a New York Times, #1 New York Times best-selling author, the top-rated professor at Wharton right now, and he's held that accolade for many years in a row. I'd like to invite Adam Grant to the stage to talk to us. Please join me in giving him an extremely warm welcome.
Well, good afternoon, everyone. I want to talk today about reaching our potential, and this is a topic I've been passionate about since I was a kid, when I had big goals of becoming a great athlete. And then I got cut from the basketball team every year, and then I got cut from the soccer team. And I was running out of options, and I discovered a really obscure sport, springboard diving. And I just fell in love with diving, and I wanted to get as good as I could. But I had a few barriers, and I actually discovered recently some vintage footage of me, my first summer diving. So I'm going to show you, this is where I began. And yes, I did have hair. Now, you're laughing at me, but so did the coaches, because it was very clear I had no potential whatsoever, abundantly clear. My nickname was Frankenstein. I was so stiff when I walked, I couldn't even touch my toes without bending my knees. And I wanted to get good at this sport. I had big goals, but I didn't know James Clear. I didn't know that I would fall. I didn't know that I would have the same hairdo as him. I didn't know that however high my goals were, I would fall to the level of my bad systems. And I went to try out for diving practice as a 14-year-old to try to make my high school team. And at the end of tryouts, my coach, Eric Best, said, "Do you want the good news or the bad news?" And I said, "Definitely the bad." And he said, "Diving requires explosive power, flexibility, and grace. You have none of those things." Is there good news? And he said, "I will never cut a diver who wants to be here." And I was like, is there any actual good news? And he said, well, diving is a nerd sport. It attracts all the people who were too short for basketball and too slow for soccer. And if you work hard at this, I think you could maybe make the state finals when you are a senior. And for some reason, that lit a fire under me. I found that motivating. And I poured everything I had into getting better at diving. And this is me 2.5 years after the first clip. Some of you are too easily impressed. Clearly. Now, it also helped that I grew about a foot. But I think that experience taught me something powerful, which is I had hidden potential. I think we all have hidden potential. I think you have it as leaders. I think your teams have it. I think of hidden potential as a capacity for growth that's invisible to you and maybe even invisible to the people around you as well. And what I want to talk about today is how you can realize your hidden potential and also bring out the best in others. Are you ready? Okay, I was going to do it anyway, but I appreciate the Wobie afternoon enthusiasm. So my first shot at recognizing hidden potential was I was teaching my first class at Wharton, and I had a student come in first week and said, I have a startup idea, and I wonder if you're interested in investing. And I listened to the pitch, and I was excited about trying to be as helpful as I could. And at the end of the pitch, I had no good news whatsoever. The idea was bad, the planning was bad, everything was bad. And so I said, I'm really sorry, I cannot invest in this startup. You can't sell glasses on the internet. Yep, that student co-founded Warby Parker, which is now worth a couple $2 billion. And thanks to that fateful day, my wife is in charge of all of our investing. I did not see the hidden potential in that founding team. I did not see the hidden potential in their idea. And one of the reasons that I failed is I made a bunch of assumptions that were once true in a prior iteration of the world and had become false. And I was too slow to rethink them. I believed that in order to sell glasses to somebody, you had to get their eyes tested, and then you had to let them try them on in an optometrist's office. And that was true in a previous iteration of the world, but it had become false, and I was too slow to rethink it. And I think our inability to question our assumptions and adapt our beliefs is one of the biggest barriers to realizing our own potential and also unlocking the potential in people and organizations. So I want to talk today about how we can solve that problem. And for me, the starting point is to change the way you think about your network. We all need a support network, a group of mentors and sponsors and cheerleaders who believe in us and try to help us succeed. But even more than that, we need a challenge network, a group of thoughtful critics who you trust to hold up a mirror so you can see your own blind spots more clearly. Your challenge network is the group of people who do the opposite of this. Instead of lining up to feed you comforting lies, they actually have the courage to tell you unpleasant truths. I don't see a lot of that in the organizations I study and in the leaders I advise. Most often what I see is a senior leader comes into work and says, "Good morning," and a bunch of people are like, "Great point." That is a terrifying world to live in. Terrifying. Your challenge network is designed to protect you from that world. Who are the best members of your challenge network? It will not surprise you that they are more likely to be disagreeable people than agreeable people. You might know agreeable people as warm, friendly, polite, welcoming, Canadian. I see we have a lot of Canadians in the room, and let me just say I'm really sorry for anything I just implied. But disagreeable people tend to be much more critical, skeptical, and challenging. They're also overrepresented statistically among engineers and lawyers, which is not a joke, that's an empirical finding. I think it's important, though. Disagreeable people are more likely to challenge you, but they don't always do it for the right reasons. They don't always have your best interests at heart. Because there is actually an I in team. I've depicted it here in red. It was pointed out to me recently that it's hidden in the a-hole. I don't know why I just told you that, but I think there's a dynamic I've been studying my whole career that some of you are familiar with. It's the question of, are the people around you more likely to be givers or takers? And that is separate from how agreeable or disagreeable they are. That is not about whether they have surface harmony and politeness and make you feel good. It is about whether underneath they are trying to make you do better and they actually care about you and your success. And I'm sure some of you are wondering if you are more likely to be a giver or a taker at this very moment. And so I thought I would give you a psychometric test. I've prepared it with a lot of research. You can take it now. Let me just say, those of you who haven't laughed yet, I'm a little worried about your taker score. No. I think that the key point here is if you want to recognize the most valuable members of your challenge network, you've got to draw the 2x2. And this is oversimplifying a lot of the complications of human nature. But when you do this, you will know there are 2 combinations you recognize quickly and 2 that you overlook. So let's start with the disagreeable takers. We hate these people. We don't waste our time with these people, and some of you might call them by a less polite name than I just did. But we get fooled a lot by the agreeable takers, also known as the fakers, who are nice to your face and then stab you in the back. They are great at kissing up and kicking down. Maybe in the Q&A we could talk about how to weed those people out of your work or your life. But if you think about your support network, I'm guessing it's mostly full of agreeable givers. They're nice, they're helpful, and that's all good. The problem is they don't like conflict. They hesitate to rock the boat. They say yes to everything. And I think we need to do a much better job valuing the disagreeable givers. Those are the people, if you're a Ted Lasso fan, they are the Roy Kents of the world. They will give you the critical feedback you do not want to hear, but you desperately need to hear. They ask hard questions. They dish out tough love. They play devil's advocate. And they do it not because they want to make you feel bad, but because they want to help you get better. I think we need to do a much better job valuing these people because these are the people who are best suited to unlock our hidden potential. Right? The disagreeable givers are the people who ultimately hold you to the highest standards and then make sure that you are accountable. I'll tell you what I've done with this information over the last few years. I've gone to some of the most disagreeable givers I know, and I've told them, hey, you might not be aware of this, but I consider you a founding member of my challenge network. First response, what the hell is a challenge network? Because disagreeable people always talk like that, obviously. No. After I explained it, I said, I know you probably feel sometimes a conflict between honesty and loyalty, but I don't see a tension between those values. For me, honesty is the highest expression of loyalty. The more candid, the more direct you are with me, the more I will know you're trying to help me grow instead of sugarcoating. And I have gotten much better constructive criticism since I've had those conversations. I think we all need to have those conversations. But we don't want to stop at criticism. I think we want to turn our critics into coaches. I think that critics are people who help you see your worst self. Coaches are people who help you become a better version of yourself. And sometimes it's a little frustrating when somebody is just critiquing you over and over and over again. You want to know, well, great, what do I do with that information? How do I get better? I had a chance to learn this early in my career. I got a call. I was in my mid-20s. I just finished my doctorate in organizational psychology. I got a call from the United States Air Force. And they said, we're wondering if you could teach leadership to our generals and colonels. And it's a 4-hour session. And we hope you could do it as pretty much any topics are fair game, but we want to make them better leaders. So that's on you. I felt a massive case of imposter syndrome. How many of you have felt imposter syndrome at some point in your career? And how many of you hesitated to raise your hands because you don't even know if you deserve imposter syndrome? Those are the real imposters in this room. I felt tremendous imposter syndrome. I'm like, okay, this is a group of generals and colonels in the Air Force. They have thousands of flying hours under their belts. They have hundreds of thousands of troops under their commands. They have multi-billion-dollar budgets. I'm not qualified to teach these people. But I'd also never tried to serve my country, and I felt a duty to at least make an effort. So I said yes. I get in, and it is even more intimidating than I had feared. The room looked like a scene out of Top Gun. And they had name tags in front of them, only instead of their actual names, they had their call signs. So I'm trying to build rapport with a bunch of people who are staring me down named Boomer, Striker, and Gunner. I'm like, this is going to go well. I do everything I can to establish my credibility. I talk about my expertise and the research I've done, and then I pour everything I know about leadership into that 4-hour session. And afterward, the feedback forms come in, and I brace myself. And I open the envelope, and the first comment says, "There was more knowledge in the audience than on the podium." And I was like, fact. And then the next comment comes in, and I open it up, and it says, "I gained nothing from this session, but I trust the instructor got useful insight." I'm glad some of you are amused by this. I was not. I remember feeling like I'm like, can humans learn to hibernate like bears? I wanted to quit my job, but I had a problem. I'd already committed to doing a second session with another group of Air Force leaders about a week later. And as a matter of principle, I follow through on my commitments. So what do I do? How am I supposed to handle another group of really tough leaders? The only thing I could think to do was to go back to the generals and colonels who had crucified me and ask them for more. But I asked a different question this time. Instead of feedback, I asked for advice. I didn't know this at the time, but research has come out in the last few years showing that you actually get better information from other people if you seek their advice than if you ask for their feedback. Feedback is backward-looking. People will tell you what you did right and definitely wrong yesterday, but that may not translate into what you can do differently today. When you seek advice, people shift their attention to be forward-looking. They tell you how you can evolve and improve tomorrow. And that's exactly what happened to me with these Air Force leaders. I said, hey, I got to do this again. Do you have any guidance? Can you offer any suggestions? And they started giving me really helpful tips instead of just making me feel totally incompetent. And one of those tips I thought was really good in particular. They said, you know what, we know you're inexperienced. Why don't you just call out the elephant in the room? And I realized I had nothing to lose. It could not go worse than it had. And so I tried to figure out, if you're a Seinfeld fan, this is my George Costanza moment. I tried to do the opposite of every instinct I had when it came to introducing myself. So I walk in the room, I look around the room, and I find the toughest, meanest looking general in the room. And I stare him down. And I say, listen, sand dune. That was his call sign. What else am I supposed to do? I didn't even know his real name. So I keep staring at him, and I say, sand dune, I know what you're thinking right now. You are thinking, what could I possibly learn from a professor who's 12 years old? And he came back and he said, that's ridiculous. You look at least 13. It broke the ice in the room. I more or less covered the same material, but I took myself off a pedestal that I never belonged on in the first place, and we had a great conversation about the research and their experience and the challenges they were facing as leaders. And afterward, I read the feedback forms, and they were night and day different. The first comment said, the professors seem to get younger every year. Or is it that I'm getting older? Either way, I liked learning about how to motivate millennials from someone who's almost young enough to be one. And although junior in experience, Adam dealt with the evidence in an interesting way. It's a great lesson for me that if you want to turn your critics into coaches, all you need to do is ask for their advice instead of their feedback. But it is not always easy to get people to give you feedback or advice. And especially as you gain status and power, people become more and more reluctant to tell you the truth. There's actually an acronym that captures it well. It's called the HIPPO effect. HIPPO stands for the highest paid person's opinion. So we got a lot of hippos in this room today. As soon as your opinion is known, people want to jump on the bandwagon. Goodbye, diversity of thought. Hello, groupthink. People want to make you feel good instead of telling you the truth. So I think the more influential you get, the harder you have to work to get people to be really candid with their comments, with their advice. And Amy Edmondson in her research has talked about this as creating a sense of psychological safety, that people know they can speak up without fear. We have extensive evidence that if you create that kind of psychological safety, you make it easier to unlock potential in people and for them to unlock potential in you. We know in hospitals, for example, when people lack psychological safety, they hide their medical errors. And then everyone else is more likely to repeat them because they don't know they happened. Whereas when they have psychological safety, they can freely admit their mistakes, study what caused them, and then evolve their routines to prevent them. We know in tech companies and in banks, when people lack psychological safety, they bite their tongues. When they have it, they let their ideas and suggestions fly. So given the importance of building psychological safety, big question is, how do you do it? And I've been studying this for a few years and done a bunch of experiments where we randomly assign leaders to do different things. And what we find most leaders do by instinct is they ask, what can I do better? Tell me your feedback. Give me your notes. If you see something, say something. And that is not enough, because people don't know whether you mean it. If I critique you or coach you, are you going to take it seriously? Are you going to be too busy to pay attention? Or are you going to get defensive and bite my head off? I don't know, so it's safer to stay silent. What we found works better is if you criticize yourself out loud and talk about your own areas for growth. When we randomly assign leaders to do this, or when we study leaders who naturally choose to do this, we find that even a year after telling their teams what they're bad at and trying to get better and how, after just doing that once, a year later, their teams are more willing to speak up and be honest with their suggestions for improvement. And I think what's happening there is you're not just claiming that you want to hear it, you are actually proving you can handle the truth by talking about all the things that you've messed up in the past, or all the notes you've been given on how you can do better in the future. So I was teaching this to my students at Wharton a couple years ago, and one of them said, well, don't you think our professors should do this too? And I had a parenting moment. I was like, nah, do what I say, not what I do. But then I thought about it, and I realized they were right. And so a bunch of us on the faculty got together, and we took the nastiest comments in our student course evaluations, and we read them out loud. Let's take a look.
It was easily one of the worst 3 classes I've ever taken, one of which the professor was let go after the semester.
The number of stories you tell give Aesop fables a run for its money. Less can be more. Ouch.
You're so nervous. You're causing us to physically shake in our seats.
Prof. Sinkinson acts all down with pop culture, but secretly thinks Ariana Grande is a font in Microsoft Word.
So great to finally have a professor from Australia. You started strong, but then got softer. You need tenure, so toughen up with these brats. I'm from Alabama.
I have to tell you, I show this video every fall in class now. I just showed it last week to my undergrads and MBAs, and afterward, the floodgates opened. I hear ideas and suggestions that I was not getting before, because I'm trying to convey to them, look, I take my job very seriously. I don't take my ego seriously at all, and the willingness to laugh at some of my mistakes and my past struggles makes it easier for them to see, yeah, they're not going to hurt my feelings. They can tell me whatever they want to suggest. And I've gone so far as to tell them, one of my all-time favorite comments was when a student wrote, "You remind me of a Muppet," because you're moving so awkwardly, and they never even told me which Muppet, which is very confusing for me. So look, when I work with leaders on this, sometimes I get pushback, and I hear leaders say, but I don't want to admit my weaknesses, because then everyone's going to find out. And I'm like, they already know. The people who work with you, you can't hide it from them. They already know what you suck at. So you might as well get credit for having the self-awareness to see your own limitations and the humility and integrity to admit them out loud. Now, of course, there are times when you wouldn't want to be that candid. One of those would be in a job interview. All right, look, so if you pause here, I think we've got a decent recipe for how to start unlocking the potential both in ourselves and in the people around us. You build a challenge network. You ask for advice on how you can get better. You critique yourself out loud so they know you can handle it. Done. But sometimes we run into situations where we miss the potential in great ideas. And I think this is especially important in this rapidly changing world we live in, where what was a bad idea yesterday could become a great idea today, and vice versa. And so I want to talk a little bit about how we recognize the potential in ideas as well as people. Let's start on the idea side. If you've ever been in a meeting and you felt like people are not getting how great this idea could be, or I'm rolling out a vision for change and my team is just not seeing the potential, what do you do? I want to do a quick exercise to illustrate why that's hard and how to overcome the challenges. What I'd like you all to do is think of a song, any song that you know. And in a moment, I'm going to ask you to tap the tune of that song on the table in front of you and see if the person next to you can guess it. So think of the easiest song you could possibly tap, or you can clap it if you prefer. You're going to go like that. They're going to guess it, and then you're going to trade places and guess theirs. I'm going to give you a minute. I wish you luck. You're going to need it. Go! All right. Okay. Look, I apologize for cutting you off here, but some of you are having too much fun. If you guessed it correctly, stand up for a round of applause. Wow. Whoa, whoa, hold on, hold on. I am not done with you yet. Back on your feet if you got it right. Back on your feet if you guessed it correctly. You can have a seat once I name your song. Let's see, happy birthday, have a seat. Okay, Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star. The ABCs. Jingle Bells. Mary Had a Little Lamb. What did I miss? Oh, my personal favorite, We Will Rock You. All right. All right, the rest of you can have a seat too. Okay. So why? Why? Why did I just make you go through this? Why did I have you do this? Because if you have children, or nieces, or nephews, or grandkids, and they ask you what you did today in New York, this is your answer. Now, this was actually a real study done years ago where before people clapped or tapped their tune, they had to estimate the probability that someone else would recognize it. Average person said 50%. Then they actually did it, and the correct guessing rate was 2.5%. Why are we so overconfident? Why do we think that 1 in 2 people will know our song when it's really more like 1 in 40? I think many of you have already figured out the answer. In order to tap your song or clap it, you have to hear the tune in your head. It's impossible to do it otherwise. And that makes it also impossible to imagine what your disjointed clapping or tapping sounds like to someone who is not hearing the tune. I'll give you mine. Here's one of my songs. Shout it if you know it. Star Wars, Darth Vader's Imperial Death March. Duh. Every time I do that, I'm convinced the whole room is going to know it. Why? Because what I'm hearing in my head in order to do it is dun, 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 dun. Meanwhile, most of you are just hearing, what the hell is that? I think this is a great metaphor for what happens when new ideas come to the table, which probably a lot of you have experienced a reaction like this. And maybe some of you have even said this, which I hope you haven't. But the problem is, it's even worse in the context of leadership. Because when you bring a new idea to other people, when you have a vision for change, you are not just hearing the tune in your head. You actually wrote the song. You have spent hours or days or weeks coming up with the lyrics and the melody, and you know them by heart. And that makes it really hard to fathom what it sounds like to somebody who's hearing it fresh for the first time. Which is why there's brand new research on thousands of executives around the world across industries showing that on average, executives are 9 times more likely to be criticized for under-communicating than over-communicating. You over-communicate and people are like, all right, we get it already, enough. No big deal. You under-communicate, people think you don't know what you're doing and you don't care, and ultimately they do not see the potential in your vision. So I don't know what your multiple is. I don't know if you under-communicate by a factor of 4 or of 5 or of 12, but I think most of us are guilty of, once we know the song, we kind of assume that other people need to already get it too. And you could just conclude from that, leadership is about mastering the art of repetition. I gotta repeat my ideas over and over and over again until other people hear them, but that's boring for everyone involved. So what I prefer is a shortcut that I learned about when I was studying Disney. For a long time, Disney had a simple formula to make animated movies. 3 steps. Step 1, borrow a classic fairy tale. Step 2, make a cartoon out of it. Step 3, rake in the profit. That was their whole strategy. And then one day, a screenwriter came in and said, we got a problem, we're gonna run out of fairy tales. Gotta learn how to write our own original scripts. So they did. They get into a big pitch meeting, and the entire room is lost. People are scratching their heads, confused, avoiding eye contact with the screenwriters. And finally, in the back of the room, a producer says, well, could you turn this into Hamlet? In that moment, the movie gets the green light. It ends up becoming the most successful film of 1994. You might have heard of it. It's called The Lion King. What is remarkable about this story is nothing I just said, but rather the original pitch for The Lion King, which I quote, this is not a joke, even though it's going to sound like one. The original pitch that the screenwriters brought to Michael Eisner was an idea for a movie about Bambi in Africa with lions. Can you imagine being in the room for that pitch? You'd be like, I have no idea what this movie's gonna be about, and I'm terrified for Bambi. You reframe it as Hamlet with lions. If you know your Shakespeare, you're like, oh, uncle's gonna kill the father. Son's gonna have to avenge it. And now you can wrap your mind around the plot and the characters. This is why it is so helpful. It's one of the many reasons why it's so helpful to optimize the breadth of your experience, not just the depth. Because the more you know what's going on in other industries, other companies, other countries, the easier it is then for you to build those bridges and say, hey, my unfamiliar idea that you don't see the potential in yet, it's actually just like this thing that's already worked over here. And I got to watch Warby Parker do that from the sidelines. When they said, we're gonna do for glasses what Zappos did for shoes. And a bunch of early investors and customers came on board. And then they got called the Netflix for eyewear, and more people got it. They're like, oh, that other thing that was only brick and mortar, now is click and mortar, maybe this could go digital too. And I think there's real value in that. And so I think that if people aren't hearing your ideas, if they're not seeing the potential in them, best thing you can do then is find something similar that's worked somewhere else that they are already familiar with, and then use that as a bridge to make your idea palatable. I think the other error that I see a lot of people making around hidden potential is missing diamonds in the rough when it comes to talent, not just ideas. And I have been guilty of this. So before I became an organizational psychologist, I led an advertising team, and I had to hire a bunch of salespeople. And I will never forget one resume that came in that was the worst fit for sales imaginable. It was a math major who built robots in his spare time. And I looked at that resume, and I almost burst out laughing, because it was such an obvious mismatch for the job. But I was desperate to hire. We were short-staffed. And so I literally interviewed everyone who applied. And this candidate came in, and sure enough, terrible candidate. And I had to go and do a weekly meeting with our president, and I explained, like, yeah, remember that candidate, math major, robot builder, cannot sell, no chance. And our president said, why? And I said, well, 45-minute interview, he didn't even make eye contact once. I didn't know a thing about neurodivergence then. It was such an obvious negative cue. And our president stared at me and said, you realize this is a phone sales job, right? Like, there is no eye contact in this job. Had never even occurred to me. I was so focused on finding cues that would confirm confirmation bias style that he was not going to be good at sales. After that, I realized I had to reboot our hiring process. And if I wanted to see potential in anybody, instead of just talking to them, I needed to give them a chance to sell. I didn't know this at the time either, but there's a century of evidence showing that if you want to gauge somebody's potential, the best thing you can do is actually give them a challenge that's really part of the job and watch how they handle it. And so I ended up designing one with a colleague. It was a lot of fun. We took the IKEA hiring process, modified for sales, and we asked candidates to sell us a rotten apple. Under the premise that everybody knows what the apple is, so it's a level playing field, but also if you could get me excited about a rotten apple, you could definitely sell our products. And I will never forget, one candidate came in one day and said, without even skipping a beat, we usually gave them a few minutes to prepare. This candidate just dove right in and said, this may look like a rotten apple, but it's actually an aged antique apple. You know the saying, an apple a day keeps the doctor away? Well, because of the nutrients in the aging process, you only need to eat one of these a week to stay healthy. And then afterward, you can plant the seeds in your backyard. So I listened to that pitch. I have some serious honesty and integrity questions about this candidate. I'm like, is any word you just said true? But I hired him. He broke multiple company records as the best salesperson on our team. And he was a math major who built robots in his spare time. And what I learned from that story was not just that I needed to see him in action to gauge his potential, but also I needed to give him a do-over. There's brand new research showing that how well somebody does a job is not indicated by how the first interview goes. It's how much growth they show from the first interview to the second. Now, you're all busy. You don't always have time to give people a do-over. But even if you could pause an interview halfway and say, hey, I've got a couple notes for you, and then watch the motivation and ability to grow from the first attempt to the second, that is a great window into, is somebody excited to get better? And also, do they have the capability to learn the skills that you're trying to get them to excel at? And I would love to live in a world where everybody gets a second chance, where everybody gets that do-over, but I think more people should get it than do currently. In order to get people on board with that kind of thinking, I think we have to change our mindsets a little bit. I think that so often what we see leaders do is they lock in to what I've come to think of as preacher, prosecutor, or politician mode. And what's weird to me about this is none of these leaders have ever worked in these jobs or professions. And yet I see it all the time, and maybe some of you have seen it in your own organizations too. When leaders go into preacher mode, they're basically proselytizing their own views. When they're in prosecutor mode, they're attacking somebody else's views. And in politician mode, they don't even bother to listen unless other people already agree with their views. So I think it's worth reflecting on what your biggest vice is of those three, because we all have one in the data that I've collected. I'll tell you that my biggest challenge is being in prosecutor mode. If I think you're wrong, I believe it is my professional and moral responsibility to correct you. And I even had a student once call me a logic bully, which I took as a compliment. I'm like, what do you mean you people don't want to be hammered with facts and data until they admit how dumb their old beliefs were? But I'm trying to do less of that because I have discovered that when I go into prosecutor mode, the other person comes to court with their best defense attorney, and nobody changes their mind or learns anything new. Somebody asked me, is there anything worse than being a full-time preacher, prosecutor, or politician at work? Only thing I could come up with was cult leader. Definitely worse. So I'd love to get a sense of the room. How many of you are occasionally in preacher mode more often than you would like? You love to drink the Kool-Aid and then sell it and serve it to everyone else. Okay, we got a bunch of potential preachers in the room. Where are the fellow prosecutors, like me? The logic bullies. Okay, and then politicians, don't raise your hands. Your colleagues already know who you are. My favorite alternative to preaching, prosecuting, politicking, or cult leading is to think more like a scientist. When I say think like a scientist, I do not mean by a microscope or a telescope. I mean, don't let your ideas become part of your identity. We all know good scientists are as motivated to look for reasons why they might be wrong, as opposed to just looking for reasons why they must be right. We know that they have the humility to know what they don't know and the curiosity to keep seeking new knowledge. And we have a growing body of evidence that if we teach leaders to think more like scientists, they actually make better choices. And for those of you who are thinking about how to future-proof your career or how to make your company more resilient in a time of chaos and crisis, I know of no better advice than to think like a scientist. I love the experiments that are done with entrepreneurs in Italy. Thousands of founders randomly assigned to a control group or a scientific thinking group. Then you can just track them for the next year. And on average, the founders in the scientific thinking group bring in 40 times the revenue of the control group. 40x, that is a staggering effect. And the key mechanism is they are more than twice as likely to pivot. The poor founders in the control group, when they launch a product or service that bombs, they still preach that they were right, they prosecute their critics for being wrong, and they politic by lobbying their boards to support the status quo. Learning to think like a scientist frees them from those traps. All of a sudden they say, I guess that experiment proved my hypothesis was wrong. And now I need to rethink my vision or my strategy or my market to try to find better product market fit. And they end up listening to ideas that make them think hard, not just the ones that make them feel good. And they surround themselves with disagreeable givers, with that challenge network, who will question their thought process as opposed to just validate their conclusions. And I think fundamentally, thinking like a scientist means recognizing every opinion you hold in your job is just a hypothesis waiting to be tested. It might have been true in the past, but it may not hold in the present. It might have been true in one environment, but it doesn't apply to the current environment you're in or to the future you're about to confront. And every decision you make is an experiment. That could be an A/B test, or better yet, an A-B-C-D test. But too often, we just implement the A and pretend there were never alternatives. And I think fundamentally, if you learn to think like a scientist, you end up building a learning culture where people say, hey, we don't know if this is going to work yet, but we think it's worth piloting. And then you get a chance to see the potential in people and ideas. So this is something I think a lot about. And I think one of the biggest mistakes that a lot of people make is they wait until they have proof in order to try an idea. I think my clicker died, so if you could manually advance this one slide, that would be most excellent backstage. And I will just keep talking in the meantime. Even better, we have another clicker. Thank you.
Just push hard.
Interesting. I'm now doubting my ability to press the clicker successfully. There we go. Whoa, we got it way back. Okay, we've caught up. So I think the mistake that a lot of people make is they wait until they feel confident to try a new idea or to stretch themselves in an area maybe that they have not proven themselves yet. So if you all think about your own hidden potential, what is a skill you want to master? What is an area of weakness that you would love to turn into a strength? What do? Well, most of us wait until we have the confidence to go and take the leap. And I learned during my springboard diving days that that was backward. I will never forget the fear that I felt as a diver. I would stand on the end of the board shaking. I was afraid of heights, by the way, so this is definitely not the sport I should have been in. But I would just stand there frozen, unable to get myself to go when it was time to try a new dive. I was afraid that I was going to belly flop, back smack, and also get lost in midair. And one day, my coach, Eric Best, said to me, I was standing on the end of the board, frozen, for 45 minutes, and he said to me, Adam, are you going to do this dive? And I was like, ever? Yeah, one day I would love to do this dive. And he said, great, then what are you waiting for? And all of a sudden it hit me that I was waiting for confidence in order to take the leap, and that was backward. That I didn't need to build confidence in order to take the leap. The way to build confidence was by taking the leap. I had to do the dive in order to feel like I could do the dive. And I think this has been a really powerful lesson throughout my life. I have constantly been in situations where I didn't think I had the potential to succeed. I sat down to think about writing a book one day and then thought, well, who am I to write a book? I'm not ready. I'm going to wait. And then I heard Eric's voice in my head. Is this something you're going to do one day? Would you like to do this? Yes. Great. Then what are you waiting for? I was terrified of public speaking. I am an introvert. I was extremely shy. I had no desire to ever get on stage. And then I got an invite to give a TED Talk. Last thing I could see myself doing was standing in the red circle. But I heard Eric's voice in the back of my head. Would you like to communicate your ideas one day? Yes. Then what are you waiting for? And most recently, after a quarter century of retirement, I decided it was time to get back on the diving board and see what I could still do. And all of the old fears came back. All of them. You can see what poor Eric had to deal with. And I got out of the water and I said, Eric, I feel like I've never went through that whole diving career. I'm still scared. And he said, okay, do you want to do this dive? And I said, yes. And he said, great, then just do it scared. And so I got on the board and I tried to turn my brain off and I said, let's just let the muscle memory do its work. And here's what happened. Now, did I make the Olympics? Hell no. Did I make Olympic trials? Not even close. Simone Biles has more talent in her pinky toe than I have in my entire body. However, I did end up making the state finals my junior year instead of my senior year. And you don't have to applaud for that, but thank you. More important than that, I ended up making the Junior Olympic Nationals twice and becoming an All-American. And that experience changed my life because I saw if I could get halfway good at something as bad as I was, like diving, then I could get better at just about anything. And so when I hesitated to think about public speaking, you know what, if I could learn to dive, I could definitely learn to talk. And when I hesitated to write a book, if I could learn to dive, I can definitely type more compelling words. And I think my biggest takeaway from that whole experience was we all need an Eric Best in our life, right? We all need a coach who says, you know what, I am not going to judge you by the talent you show today. I am going to judge you by the distance I think you're capable of traveling tomorrow. I think if you can find that coach, you're better poised to reach your potential. If you can be that coach, you will elevate other people to their potential. Thank you all.
It was a really good speech, Adam. Thank you.
Thanks, Charlie.
Good.
You ready for this?
Ready. We've got about 10 minutes for questions, if that works for you.
Let's do it.
Sit down here. I'm going to try and, these questions are coming in from the audience right now. I'm going to try and bucket a few of them. The first group of questions are on your matrix of agreeable, disagreeable, giver-taker. You said very early on in that talk that you would give us some advice on how to keep agreeable takers out of our lives. Tell us about that.
Yeah, okay, so we can actually test you all right now. Let's do this. So what I'd like you to do is think about a taking behavior from your organizations like theft, stealing from your workplace. Question is, what % of employees in a typical month do you think would steal at least $10 from your organization? We'll define theft: cash, IP, materials, merchandise. All right, show of hands. How many people think 0 to 20% of employees are thieves? Raise your hands. Raise them high so we can spot the optimists in the room. Okay, 21 to 40%. 41 to 60%. 61 to 80. 81 to 99. Anyone for 100? Okay, I hope not, because that would include you. Take your results with a grain of salt, but the data show the higher your estimate that other people are thieves, the greater the chances that you're a thief. If you are sitting near someone with an 80 or higher estimate, I would check your wallet or your purse now. Now, look, there are lots of ways you could give a high estimate without being a taker, but what we see in the data is people answer questions about others' behavior by asking themselves, well, what would I do? What have I done? And then they project that. So an extreme taker is like, well, last week I stole $400,000. $10 a month has got to be pretty common, 94%. Whereas an extreme giver is like, how do you even steal $10 from, like how many pens do you have to take home to add? What kind of person would do such a thing? I don't know, 4%. And these differences play out in large samples. We see that takers anticipate more selfish behavior from others because that's how they rationalize and justify being a taker. So here's how you apply this. Think about the taking behavior you are most worried about in your workplace. Could be hoarding knowledge instead of sharing it. Could be stealing credit for other people's ideas. Could be dumping grunt work on others. You ask candidates how common they think that is. And then if they give a high estimate, you don't say, you're a taker, go home. Instead, you ask them, how did you come up with your estimate? And you will hear legitimate answers like, I used to work with a lot of thieves, or it was my job to catch thieves, and the base rate is much higher than you thought. Those are fine. The deadly answer is when somebody says, I just believe deep down that humans are fundamentally selfish, which is code for I'm fundamentally selfish. So that's how I like to weed out the agreeable takers.
That's a really good one. This person declares themselves a disagreeable giver, and they say, how can they give advice to leaders that don't seem ready to hear their advice?
Oh, yeah, okay. So disagreeable givers are at greatest risk for going into prosecutor mode. So as I told you, I've been guilty of that over and over again. Of, the more convinced I am that you're wrong, the harder I will try to logic bully you out of your wrong-headed views. And I've learned over time that that's counterproductive because it just leads people to dig their heels in. And so what I've found effective instead is to say, what would a good scientist do in that moment? A good scientist would get humble and curious and say, look, I don't know what's going to change this person's mind. And I'm really curious to find out what that is. What a good scientist would not do is be like, what an odd specimen. How does this person even exist? How does their brain work? So what I try to do in those interactions, and I think this is especially helpful if you are on the disagreeable end of that spectrum, is I go into the conversation, and when I notice somebody showing resistance, I'll just get really intrigued and say, it seems like you're not buying my suggestion right now. Like, why am I here? Like, why did you call me? Like, I have other things to do. You are very busy. If you were not going to find my ideas at all plausible or credible, like, why? We need to waste our time. And sometimes they'll immediately tell me my value, and then I'm like, okay, they're arguing for the worth of my work. But the better question for me, and whenever I remember to ask this, it's a game changer. I like to just look at them and say, so you don't seem sold. What evidence would change your mind? That question completely transforms the nature of the conversation. Because I want to know what would persuade you that you are wrong. And it forces you to ground the conversation in facts and logic. And I've never had anybody, except in one situation, say, nothing would change my mind. There's no proof that could possibly move me. The one time that happened, I was with the founder of a big startup. And she said, look, I'm sorry, nothing could convince me that my vision was wrong. And meanwhile, her companies were afraid that her employees were afraid the company was going to go bust. And I said, really? Like, nothing could convince you that your vision and strategy are going to fail? And she said, no, nothing. I'm that sure. And all of a sudden, I realized we had a case of founder syndrome, where once she was right when everyone told her that she was wrong. And now she overgeneralized that belief that whenever everyone says she's wrong, she must be right. And so I said, instead of trying to fight with her, I said, oh, this is so interesting. So this vision and strategy, this is a religion for you. It is just a matter of faith. And she backpedaled, and she said, well, no, of course not. Like, surely there's a version of the world where this would fail. And I was like, oh, interesting, what would that look like? And she mapped out the literal world we were about to enter. And then the company ended up pivoting their vision and strategy, and they still exist this day. So that's my favorite thing to do. Ask what would change your mind.
Very good advice. The next question is from someone at the opposite end of the spectrum. Can you be psychologically too safe?
No. Next question.
Okay, last question.
Wait, let me just elaborate really quickly, which is, I think people worry, when we talk about psychological safety, people think, oh, we're going to get soft, or we're going to be too nice. That is a misunderstanding of psychological safety. Psychological safety is not about making everyone comfortable. As Amy Edmondson defines it, it's about making everything discussable, meaning we are willing to get comfortable being uncomfortable. You cannot have too much of that, right? You cannot hear too many important concerns people have. You cannot hear too many good ideas. What has to happen, though, is psychological safety needs to be coupled with accountability. So psychological safety is about saying nothing bad will happen to you if you are honest around here. Accountability is about saying, I have very high standards for what ideas I implement and what advice I take. And so I don't want to hear the random thought you had walking in. I want to hear your best ideas. I want to hear your most important concerns. Yep. And what the research shows on this is if you couple psychological safety with accountability, you get a sustainable level of not only high performance, but also learning and growth. Because people can talk about the things that are going poorly and then figure out how to make them better.
Last question on psychological safety. Does your advice change in the context of being a minority? So the idea of self-criticism, does that change if you're starting from a position of a minority?
Okay, that's I think a really important question, and I'm glad it was raised. So let me answer it using our data. So what we did was we randomly assigned leaders to critique themselves out loud. And then we saw this big spike in people's willingness to raise problems and solutions, to be critics and coaches. And then the question is, what does that do to your image as a leader? Do you start to jeopardize other people's opinions of your competence? And we looked at every single demographic group in the data. So we had leaders of at least 5 different racial groups. We had dozens of countries represented in some of our studies. We have leaders with varying levels of experience. We have more than 3 categories of gender. And what we see is there are no consistent costs of critiquing yourself for any group. Now, that being said, it is easier to do one particular kind of critique if you are a white man, which is self-deprecating humor. There's some research on this by Jarrell Slaughter and colleagues where they show that when a man pokes fun at himself, people already assume he's competent, and so he just looks warm and humble. Whereas when a woman makes fun of herself, especially if she's a woman of color, people are less likely to take for granted her competence and more likely then to say, huh, I wonder if she's up to the task. Now, Charlie, I have to tell you, it's embarrassing that this research holds. It's 2025. Like, what century are we living in that we still are judging people by the gender or race that they belong to, as opposed to the quality of contributions that they make? And so every time when I open an academic journal and see research on differences between groups and how they're judged as leaders, my dream is these results are no longer going to hold. And I think we're making a little progress. I have one piece of good news on this. There's a meta-analysis by Posse and Underdahl and colleagues. It's 99 studies of over 100,000 leaders. This is every study that has ever compared men and women in leadership roles over the course of many decades. And the first question is, who's more confident in their leadership skills? And what you see is men are much more confident than women. There's a huge gap. Women are like, I don't know how this is going to go. Men are like, I am the greatest leader in the history of the universe. And then you get 360 data and ask who is more competent. And the results flip. Women are rated as better leaders than men, on average. Now, do I believe that biologically women are hardwired to be better at leadership than men? At this point, yeah, no. Do I believe, though, that women have had to be that much better in order to not only break through glass ceilings, but also get off sticky floors and clear bottlenecks in the middle? Absolutely. And so I think a lot of people recognize this. So I think the punchline here is we need to normalize being honest about your capability. We need men to be aware of what they suck at as leaders and talk about that. And we need women to have the permission to talk about their strengths and not get judged as full of themselves.
Well, the audience really loved that one. Very good answer. The next and probably last topic is AI. Does your recommended approach to interviewing, assessing talent, developing talent change in the world of new technologies like AI? Or is it everything you've taught us before remain the same?
Oh, can I say both? Everything changes and everything stays the same. First of all, I'd like to congratulate you, Charlie. This is the longest I've sat on a stage this year without AI coming up. Impressive. But of course it has to come up because it is changing the way we work on a daily basis. Here's what I think we know at this stage, and I'm going to put a giant asterisk on this because when I say no, I'm referring to studies that have been published in the last few months, and as our AI tools evolve, the answers may change. I think what we know right now is a couple things. Number one, in most jobs, people who are struggling, either because they're new or because they're not yet that competent, benefit more from AI tools than the best performers. So AI is empirically more of a skill leveler than it is an advantage to the best, and I think that's great news because it's going to cover a lot of our training gaps. The same way in schools, AI tutors are really effective, that they can give you a quick quiz, figure out what you don't know, and then give you an immediate crash course in that knowledge and level up your ability. I think we're seeing that in tons of jobs. I think that's great news. I think the second thing we're seeing very clearly is that AI has already beaten humans at two things that I thought were fundamentally and forever human, which are creativity and empathy. We have lost both of those races in the past year. And it's not even close. On empathy, you can see this with doctor-patient interactions and also just human kind of friend-seeking emotional support interactions. What you see is if you are making a request of a chatbot and you don't know whether it's human or AI, the AI response makes you feel more seen and more supported than the human response. Now, if we tell you it was an AI, you don't like it anymore. But I don't know how long that's going to last. Do I think that AI is better at empathy than humans? No, I think the average human is terrible at empathy.
Yeah.
And like, large language models have the entire store of how to actually respond to somebody else's concern, as opposed to making it about you, and they do that by default, right? Creativity, it looks even worse. There was recently a Shark Tank style series of experiments where ideas are submitted to business plan competitions by AIs and by humans. And then the judges rate them blind and actually invest in them. And of the 40 top ideas by these world-class venture capitalists, the top 39 were AI generated.
Wow.
39 of the 40. I don't know where that one human is, but 39 of the top 40 were AI generated. And again, I don't think AI has any creative genius. What it has is two things that are fundamental to generating new ideas, which is it can generate huge volume and huge variety. What AI is not good yet at is idea selection.
Yep.
I think we still need human judgment in order to figure out which ideas are worth pursuing, just like we still need human judgment to figure out which humans we should invest in. And so I think as you think about your roles as leaders, and especially when you think about talent, I think the best analogy I can offer is think about an airplane. For decades, autopilot has been more accurate and more reliable, frankly safer, than having a human pilot. How many of you would board an airplane without a human in the cockpit?
Right.
Even today? You probably wouldn't. And I think when it comes to human judgment, some of that is irreplaceable, and I think that means long live humans.
Well, that's where we're going to end. We have like another 50 questions, but we're up on time. Adam, thank you so much. It was a really
Thank you,
insightful
Charlie.
talk.
Honored to share ideas with you all. Thank you for having me.
Thank you, Adam. Yes. Thank you. Thank you.
Thanks, Adam.
Thanks, Chris.
Thanks, Charlie. Thank you. Okay, thank you very much to Adam and Charlie. We're going to move straight on now to our next session, and to introduce our next speaker, please welcome to the stage Angelica